Three, two, one, and welcome back to the SBH podcast. Okay, so in this podcast, I'm going to really talk about how I'm starting to transition into fishing off of sandy beaches right now and why and what that's entailed. And I'm talking about I'm in the infancy of that. Like I just started fishing in the estuaries or in the off the sandy beaches. I've been doing a lot of estuary fishing this spring. It's been very successful, and I did a bunch of fishing off the rocks. I'm going to continue to do that. It's going to start really heating up off the rocks very soon. But right now, the best bites are going to be right at the entrances of river mouths, because the bass are feeding on adult bunker, at least where I'm at, and that's where the bigger bass have been. Guys in boats are just killing them, just a little bit offshore, and the hopes are that those fish are going to end up coming onshore, and then you'll be able to pattern down into a bite. But I was fishing on a beach, and it's funny because I'm again, I know how to fish. I have a broad I have a very broad understanding of how to fish almost every single type of structure. But, you don't really get that full, you just don't get that full, how could you say, understanding, I guess. I was going to say something else, but I guess we can just go with understanding. You don't get the full understanding of how to fish an area until you put in hours into it. And, generally you start off, catch a lot, and maybe you catch a few schoolies, you get skunked a few times, but then you kind of start patterning out something, and I'm just starting to do that. But the problem is the beaches, or at least the beach that I'm trying to start to learn how to fish, is enormous. And it's, I walked, 2 miles, and to just be able to see, with 2 miles to one section of the beach that had some rips. And that's what I was wanted to do. That's what I was targeting. And I walked, had to have been, it was a solid hour of walking 4 miles. It was ridiculous. Maybe a little over, it was probably over an hour. But I was walking forever through estuary, onto beach, pass on bad structure to good structure, and then not being able to really, because, you get there and then you look, and I'm just at the point of this beach that is miles long on either side. And there's rips and sandbars and all of it looks so juicy. I'm like, how do I pick the one structure section that's going to be more productive? And I've got to talk to some people, fish with some guys that know a little bit more about fishing off sandy beaches, especially that one in particular. Because it's so daunting to just go and cross your fingers and say, well, maybe I can get a bass there today, and spend 2 hours walking. Is it worth doing that? Is it worth doing that every single time you have to try it? Can I bike out there? Which I can't do. And I just need to think about a lot of things. The best time to explore those types of beaches, especially because of the bugs during the day, is at night, and just because it's cooler and you can walk a lot more of it. But then at the same time, it's harder to see structure. So it's a whole thing. It's really it's a very interesting thing, but I need to really start patterning down a lot here. And by patterning down stuff, I need to, what my mental model is I'm going to clump the beach into I don't even know. Oh gosh, it's so big, half-mile sections. And I'm going to clump each half-mile section down the beach until I can end up being successful or at least figuring out, okay, this works here and this doesn't. Which means, so this is how I go about finding things. You fish stuff, see if you can get some schoolies in an area, then you try to pinpoint exactly why and where, and then you fish that on every single tide, and then you see if that's productive. If it's not, then you bail. And a lot of that is so much time. It's a lot of time, but I've never tried to piece together something of this magnitude. And as I said, I really want to get better at fishing the estuaries and fishing off the sandy beaches because I don't want to be a one-dimensional fisherman. I want to be able to fish in every single facet of fishing. I want to be able to fish in back bays, estuaries, rivers, rocks, beaches, like everything. And it's so difficult to do that in general and to do that well. But I want to be able to know that, hey, if there's a wind direction in this direction, and I know I don't want to be fishing off the rocks or in the estuary, and it's later in the summer, I need cooler water. Okay, I'm gonna go here, and that's like in this area is just all beach. I'm like, I have to, I got to think to myself. I'm like, am I gonna be able to actually figure it out? It's so crazy to me because I personally don't care as much about catching schoolies. I really want to focus in on catching big fish, but you got to do the groundwork to get into those bigger fish. And I think that's a big problem with people that are starting out in the sport is when you're starting out, you don't want to have to put in that groundwork to end up catching those bigger bass. And I'm still very young and I've haven't really fished very long compared to a lot of guys, but the amount of, I put in more hours than you'd ever care to imagine, but I put those hours in on the back end, as in I don't necessarily put those hours in fishing. I put them in on research and studying and reading and Google Earth and all of that. Like that's where your time really comes in handy. And you're like, okay, so that structure is like this. If I fish it on this tide and this tide and this tide, you'll be able to figure out what's the best bite. If I fish it with this wind, it's going to amplify the current and the bass are going to be sitting there. So, I know a lot about like, okay, you want to, if you have a day, let's say the wind's blowing from you say the current is moving from left to right, which is like a westerly current or westerly wind, sorry. And you want the wind to be blowing with the current to amplify the current. If it's blowing against it, it just kind of slows the current down a little bit and the fishing isn't as good. So you want to get with that same wind direction, same current. Sorry about that. My computer just yelled. Anyway, so I want to focus on that and wind direction and everything like that, but I don't want to not be able to fish that area and learn it. And I really want to learn it, and it's been blowing the same wind direction every single day for like a week, which is fine. It's actually a good wind direction, and I like it to fish off of certain areas. But I kind of wanted to switch up a little bit so that I can try to fish a few other areas, maybe get and anyway, so I just really want to figure out some different spots. And the more areas and the more diversity you can throw into your fishing, the better. But I do think that out of all the places that I've ever started to learn how to fish, the sandy beach is by far, and there's nothing even compared, like there's nothing that compares to how difficult it is to figure it out. And you might say, oh, you can see rips, you can see bars, you can see that, but what happens if you have 7 miles of that exact same structure? That if you think about, you're like, okay, that all looks really good. So why would a bass be on this bar and not that bar, And that's where you got to really pattern everything down to, okay, it's the deepest bar in this section, it's the most current going through here. It's the point, and that's what I need to figure out is what is most important to these fish. And this is like, it's interesting to think about because I spent probably 2 hours, like an hour and 45 minutes walking yesterday to take probably take 10 casts in an area and turn around and walk the other direction for another hour and a half. So if you think about that, that's 4 hours of walking to figure out. So what I'm saying is it doesn't make sense to put all your time into that walk. Now, if that was super productive, then that's a whole different story. But I need hours, and I need a whole day, like an entire day, to figure out one small little section. Like, I'd probably need upwards of 10 hours to fish one section at one tide with one wind, write that everything that happens into my fishing log, and then fish the next tide in the next wind in the and you want to go down every single one of those until you kind of pattern down that area. You're like, okay, so there's a bar here, and that bar ends up connecting to the beach, and the bass are here. And then you're like, okay, now I caught three 20-inch bass here on a pencil popper during the day. At night I went and I threw a dart or super strike darter or a Pumbaa plug shad swimmer or something like that in there, and got a bass that was 25 inches, one that was 26, or I didn't catch anything. And you got to like go through all of this trial and error, and a lot of the time you get skunked. And that's what I was saying, like if I'm fishing off the rocks, I don't get skunked even if I'm trying a new area. But when I'm fishing off the beach, it's a whole new story. I'm a brand new person to that beach. I don't really know what's going on there. I know that it's productive in certain rips, but it's also one of the most difficult things to figure out in general. Now, do I fish the beaches a lot? No. Do I want to? 100%. I think that they're easy. I think that big fish swim across them all summer long. And I think it's one of the easiest and best ways to catch big fish if you can figure them out. But they're the most difficult structure to figure out because it's soft structure. It can change literally day to day. It could change, and it gets so complicated when it gets to why would a big 30-40 pound bass set up in this current or in this rip, and how do you narrow everything down? And you got to think about it that way, because otherwise you're never going to catch a big bass if you don't figure out that perfect spot. Everything has to be perfect in order for that big fish to be there. Now, people, I get DMs from people saying, why do you talk about their like 40 pounders like they're everywhere? And the reason I talk about them like they're everywhere is because when you're fishing an area, if you don't believe you're going to catch a 40 pounder in every single time you cast, then don't fish there. That is my firm belief. Now, every single time that I'm going out to fish what I like to say monster hunting, I think I'm going to catch a 40 pounder with every single one of my casts. And that's how you actually end up catching a 40 pound bass, is because you think you're going to catch a 40 pound bass, and that gives you the confidence, that gets you prepared. And that's half the battle, is if you are confident and prepared, then if that fish happens to hook into a fish like that, you're going to be right there and ready to go for it, and you're not going to get caught off guard. And on top of that, you could be doing something, you just, everything, I mean, it's so hard to explain to someone that is, like I try to think of that, like when if you don't do it as much as, like I fish 3 times a day, probably at each section, probably 3-hour chunks, morning, afternoon, and then at night every day, all summer long. And so I fish so much that I'm in during the day. Most of the time I'm just targeting schoolies, getting the rod bend, having fun, throwing a little top water. It's all good. Then I don't really seriously start fishing until nighttime. Now, this could be my downfall. There's many times that I have hooked big bass during the day, but I just don't tend to target larger bass during the day just because it's just so difficult to get a really big bass to eat something during the day. It happens. I've had it happen. I've had those moments where you're like catching 12-inch bass and then you hook a 40-inch bass. It's very different. It's like, because you just never know. I fish these spots that produce big bass, and I know there are big bass around. It's just like you never know when you're going to get that big bass to eat in between those 25 schoolies, and how you can single out that big bass while still having fun and still getting the rod bent and making yourself happy with casting and whatever. And your time that you're spending, that's really important. If you feel like your time's fulfilled, then that's going to keep you coming back. Now, when I do that walk that was legitimately 4 hours of there and back walking, I wasn't angry that I didn't catch anything because I didn't think I was going to catch anything. I was only trying to remind myself that is as big and as intimidating as it actually is. Now, I want to catch a 40 pounder off the beach, okay? So that's what I'm going to go for. I want to catch a 30, 40 pound bass off the beach. Now, 100% there are bass cruising down that beach in those rips, staging up for those bait, especially bait. The amount of adult bunker that's around and the amount of people that I've talked to and heard and whatever that have got 45-inch bass offshore in the past week. I mean, it was obviously the new moon, but off of these bunker schools is ridiculous. I know probably I literally had 6 different conversations with guys catching bass between 38 and 47 inches, I think was the biggest one that I heard. But so that's what I'm dealing with, and they're all in my area, and they're all out of these river mouths, and so, but most of this is boat fishing. I heard one, I think, from land. I know some other guys that have been getting them pretty good in the rivers and the estuaries, and some bigger bass too. I'm just not that good at fishing in monster hunting in estuaries. It is getting a little bit warmer. I do feel pretty confident in the estuary, but the spots that I think are gonna produce, you really gotta it's gonna be one of those bites that's because the current, there's a lot of current and there's a lot of tide movement. You go from it being 5 feet deep in an area to it being 10 feet deep in an area in an hour. And that bite might just be because of that one set of structure that's making this current rip in here or swirl in here, eddy, and the bass are just chilling right in the current, and then that disappears with that rising current, and you can't get there with your plugs or whatever. So it's difficult to spend a lot of time fishing in an area because you could be fishing there the right day, the right tide, I guess, or everything's perfect, but the right tide, I mean, you might be half an hour to an hour on the right side of the tide, but fishing at the wrong time, if that makes any sense. So what I'm trying to say is if you could be fishing the right side of the tide, so the incoming, but you started fishing an hour earlier and you leave right before it starts up because you're not getting anything. And that's just what happens a lot of the time in that specific type of structure. Now it does happen off the beach too. But it doesn't happen as much off the rocks. I can stay on a bite off the rocks, and I know you can the estuaries and off the beaches too. But this is besides the point. I guess I shouldn't even be saying this because every rule is meant to be broken in fishing. But really, you can stay on a bite for a long time off the rocks because the bass tend to not really change unless the tide changes. Compared to fishing in an estuary or off the sandy beaches where the tide swings out and structure starts to drop. I guess it can kind of be the same thing, but then it's a big change. Not as much off the beach, but more in the estuaries and rivers. And so this is where I'm at right now. I'm how much time do I need to put in to then be productive, and be productive for a bunch of keepers, to then know that, okay, if I go eel this, maybe I can pull a 20-pound bass. And then if I can pull a 20-pound bass, then I'm okay, maybe if I tweak a few things, I can turn that 20-pound bass into a 30 or a 40. And not to discredit any 20-pound bass, because a 20-pound bass is a nice bass any day of the week, any time of the year. But there's definitely levels to that. A 20-pound bass could still be under that. They're kind of in that same section as being a schooling bass. Not a schoolie, but a bass that's going to be in a school. You could see a 40-inch bass in a school with a bunch of 28 to 30-inch bass. They're going to be a 40-inch bass in that school. I wouldn't qualify that as a schoolie, but I would say it can be in a school of fish. Obviously, you can get giant bass in giant schools, but I'm just saying that as far as schooling fish goes, you can have that size range be kind of together and be lucky to pull one of those out. What you really want to focus on is trying to see if you can fish at a time where you have that transition from all those schoolies being there to either when the current is so ripping through that spot that they don't like to be expending that amount of energy because they're too small, to then there being a massive fish there because it can expend that amount of energy without or it can like easily sit there without expending too much energy and get bait and everything like that. And that's why you want to like really try to specifically orient yourself to fish when you have really strong bites turning into these bites that are slowing down, and then pick back up again, which transition and bite times are very important anywhere you're fishing. Like you have you have that sunset to it being just dark to then it being really dark. And those three well, you can have it from bright to sunset to that like, just got dark section to pitch black. And that all of those can switch. I've had bites during the day, shut off right at sunset, turn back on when it gets dark, like when it's darker but not completely black, and then when it gets black, it shuts off. So you have those different times that the bass are feeding, and if you hit one of those zones bad, man, I can't dry. If you hit one of those zones badly, you will, you might not do as well. And it's so much, there's so many variables in fishing. And that's what makes it fun is, you really got to figure a lot of stuff out to be able to do it successfully. And the more you figure out, the further you get down the rabbit hole. And the more I've figured out is just bass behavior is so interesting and how it changes between different structure. And structure is so interesting as well when you think about a bass that its whole objective is to eat as easily as possible and as much as possible. And for a bigger bass, that tends to mean bigger meals, so you kind of have to figure out, okay, this bass doesn't want to expend a lot of energy to eat, but it wants to find a way that it can eat as big a bait as possible. Now, bunker is a great example of this. Now, there's a lot of bunker at these river mouths, and the river mouths are coming in and coming out. And when it's dumping out, it's dumping the bait out into the open water. And when it's coming in, it's pushing a little bit of bait in with it. And sometimes you can sit, obviously the bass are in that area trying to feed on those bass. The same way like the Cape Cod Canal works, where you have that flush of bait coming in one side and then coming out the other, whatever. I don't really know how that works, but that's essentially like the same thing as fishing a river or an estuary. For bigger fish, it's kind of that way, except not to that extent. And then you have something like a rip, where that's just that whole thing where you have like a sandbar or two sandbars, and they're, if you think about it, current coming in one side of the sandbar and then flushing out in one area, that's condensing where the bait has to go and the bass are going to be there. And then you have like sandbar attaching to the shore with the current coming through one side and getting trapped in there in that section, and the bass are sitting there. And then you have, and when you look at it, like when you're walking down the beach and you see a sandbar and then a little space, another sandbar, and then a long sandbar, and then sandbar going to the beach, and that's all in 1 mile stretch, but that's 1 mile of a 10-mile beach. How do you figure out that? I don't know if it's 10 miles, but I'm just saying. And it's probably, it's got to be, if that's 2 miles to there, that's probably I'd say it's about 5 to 6 miles, this beach that I'm fishing. And you're trying to figure this out, and so your mental model is, can you fish half-mile sections or half of a half mile? And you trying to split these up into chunks that are manageable for you to cover. And then after you cover that, you might be able to cover different water directions in different what I'm trying to say is, like, you have bars that are making the water go in different directions. You have one bar that's making the water come out this way, and the other bar is the water's coming in this way, and the other bar the water's going straight out. And the bass could be anywhere in that whole mix. How do you figure out where they are? And that's only in half of a half-mile section. Just humor me on this. And that's just one little section, and there might be zero fish there. but that's going to take you probably 6 hours to fish that little tiny sliver, and then you fish the next little sliver, the next little sliver, the next little sliver, all the way down this beach. It's going to take you months, if not years, to figure out how to fish this beach. Now you got to figure out, okay, what beach is going to be the most productive? I know people have taken 50-pound bass from this beach. So like, you think about that, yeah, that was a few years ago. Yeah, this beach is probably not fishing well as it did then. But if you think about that, that's a big ass fish to come off of there. And the bass there have to be some larger bass around. It's not like they just disappear. They're gonna come through those same spots. Yeah, stuff changes over time, bait patterns change, everything like that. But you know that the bass are gonna be relatively following the same rules. If you can evolve with the fish and with how the fish are fishing, you can be very productive. And that's why if you can be productive in this climate, when it starts switching around again, because I think it's going to start to switch back around to being very productive again. I think we're about to see it turn. And I think that stuff is going to go down way before then. Like I'm saying that, like, I believe that we're going to have this little, like, the slot limit, the less people fish, like no commercial fishermen at the canal, like all of that stuff is going to slowly grow and grow and grow until there's going to be much better regulation of this species, and there'll be much less of this species being needlessly killed, and that's going to help a lot of things out, but it's going to actually create better and better fishing. Obviously, it's going to be better and better fishing, and then stuff is going to start to switch back around. But we're at what I would say is probably the worst. Well, I think we went past the worst section. I think it's going to only get better from here. To this year is actually a blessing in disguise. It helped bait out a lot. It helped the bass because, a lot of people weren't fishing early in the year. I guess there's more people fishing, but not as much like charter boats going around. And I definitely think it helped a good chunk of those bass to survive the season and or get very healthy with the amount of bait that's around. And I think that if we utilize that and we think about, okay, there's so much bunker around right now, or Atlantic menhaden, pogies, whatever you want to call them, and how do you, like, obviously the bass are following those around. Those fish are going to be around those river mouths for, I would say, probably another 2.5 weeks, and then they're going to start switching into the rocks pretty full time, pretty much. Those bigger bass are going to be in the rocks like they were last year, like they were in late July. And I think late July is the time frame to really push hard in the rocks, from late July all the way through October, and then go back into the estuaries and back bays. But until October, especially on Cape Ann, you really you see amazingly big fish in there, and they're very willing to eat. And I definitely think that there was a big biomass wave of bass that pushed through when I caught my 40-incher a few weeks or a week ago or whatever that was. So that was that first big push. Now there's a lot of big bass around right now. Big bass coming through the canal, which is really when, as soon as that happens, we got huge bass instantly. Like, they're in. And they're going to be all on these bunker schools that have been everywhere. Estuaries, harbors, beaches, like, it's been insane. And they're finally going to have bass on them. And if we're lucky enough and fortunate enough, we might be able to pattern down some stuff as shore fishermen, where these bunker are going to get pushed closer to the shore with very strong onshore winds. That's what I would say. If you can find a river mouth and you can set up in a spot with a really strong onshore wind, and when I talk about really strong, over 30 miles an hour, is going to push bait in bass as well. And then find yourself a rip, hopefully something that the bass are like with the current, hopefully something where the bass can really stage up, and then fish that all night long with eels, with big plugs. And I'd be shocked if you didn't pull a big fish from that. But you need to know, on top of all of that, you need to know, and this is what I'm trying to figure out right now, and this is what stage I'm in right now, you need to figure out the best time, the best current, the best wind direction, all for that one spot, and then you can implement, okay, there's a 35 mile an hour wind, 40 mile an hour wind, the bass are going to be here, right at that point. Then you don't have to spend your whole life fishing there in order to get that one little bite. You can just say, okay, I need to target them now, and they're going to be there. And that's what it got to for me on the rocks. I would literally fish for an hour, 2 hours, and I would catch, a few very large fish, 20 pounders, and then a few 40s would get sprinkled in, and then the bite would shut off. And that's all you really want, though. I mean, you want more than that, but obviously if you can figure that out and really not have to fish 10 hours to get that hour bite, then don't fish 10 hours. Fish that 1 hour that you're going to be getting that hour to half hour bite, and then it's going to shut off. And most of the time, and that's more or less on either side of that. Sometimes it's a shorter bite, sometimes it's longer, but that's essentially what you got to do to be productive and be well calculated. Because at one point you fish too much, you stop paying attention to the little things and the little cues that are starting to pick up, and then you start making mistakes. And then if you get fortunate enough to hook into that bass, it's more than likely you're going to lose it because you make a silly mistake. Now, if you can, and it's just this whole thing that like I just stood there on the side, like when I got to the spot that I was going to be fishing, and I turned and I looked down the beach, and I was like, oh man, I got my work cut out for me, because this thing is miles long, and I mean miles. Now, if I had a boat and I could go through that and graph it all out, I'd be ahead of the game. For me, I'd be able to figure out, okay, this is where the structure is. I see bass in this hole. I see bass in this hole. I need to fish this, and this. That's always a great way to do it. Unfortunately, as shore fishermen, we don't have that luxury to figure that out, or at least get that knowledge. Your best bet is to ask a guy, that's fished there a while, and that's kind of what I'm in the works about to do. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just trying to still play around with it in my mind if I'm gonna go ask for help to figure some stuff out. But I don't want to ask for help, because then it kind of takes some of the guesswork out of it, because I really want to figure it out for myself. Even if other people already know this, I like to really figure these places out for myself without any real prior knowledge. Although if you do you don't even have to ask people a lot of the time. Most of the time, if it's a pretty well-known beach for fishing or area for fishing, and you look it up, you should be able to find an article out there on somebody that fishes it or has fished it and knows a lot about that area. And or beaches that are similar to that, you read about them, you figure them out, you're saying, okay, this guy's talking about this rip and how to fish this and that, and then you just apply that to your area, you apply that to your beach, and then you should be able to start creating a bite. And then out of that bite, you should be able to start creating the times that the biggest bass are gonna be in those areas. And that's what I'm in the works of doing right this very second, is trying to figure out a spot. And I really wanted to talk about that because it's so interesting to me, that you can spend so much time and effort figuring something out and either get nowhere or get everywhere. And the fact that we do what we do is hilarious, because I'm like spending, I'm going to spend a whole good solid month to fish half this beach and to really get to know half this beach, or at least a good amount of rips on the beach. And if they're productive, I'll be fishing certain ones. There's probably other ones that are going to be even more productive, but it's hard to find one productive one at a 40 and, only have fished 30 of them and find one productive one. And, there's many other ones you can fish, but you don't want to really try to fish all those other ones if that one is being productive, even though another one could be even more. Then the other question you have is, okay, now you're getting into this, you have structure at low tide that's here, and then if you walk another little bit out, there's some more bars, then a little further out, there's some more bars, and there's current that reaches through here and there, and do you wade out to these spots? Do you do this, to that? There's so many, and I love it. There's so many variables to think about. There's rocky structure on one side. There's estuaries on both sides. Like what do you do? I mean, it's so nuts to think about how to piece together something like this. And I'm really I've thought about this down to the ground in only one little section of it, and what I saw at that one little moment of low tide, and I'm like, okay, this structure looks good. This current is strong. The bass should be here. Nothing, not even a touch, and that's what's interesting is because you think structure is really productive, and then it's not. And I've caught multiple bass on that beach with pencils, little pencil poppers, just for fun, just throwing them around, just to get a rise out of some bass. And that's what you want to do. Find a plug that covers water really well and fish that plug. And if you can get a bass or you can get some sign of a bass in that area, then you can start to narrow down your window and your structure window, as I like to call it, I guess. You start out with all of this that you have to fish, and then you can just kind of figure it out. Okay, that's where they are. Out of all of this, you have rip going to here, sandbar, current, another sandbar out here, more current. They're going to be right there between that section could be 25 yards of, you have a rip that comes to here. It could be anything. It could literally be anything, and that's where the deepest water in that area, that's where the bass are going to be. Who knows what it's going to be for this beach? Who knows what it's going to be for these spots? I know there's some guys that are fish there a lot and are very productive in it. But, I just have so much to think about. I hope I can keep you guys up to date on this. If you have any suggestions on how to fish, I know a lot of stuff, but, it's always good to hear. No matter how big your level of fishing is, you can learn from anyone because everybody fishes a little bit differently. And sometimes certain conversations and certain questions and everything like that sparks ideas in your brain or other people's brains. And I love the conversations I have through DM. So always feel free to DM me about things because I love talking about and discussing structure of all sorts and learning this. And because, I'm new to that area. I know a lot about fishing and targeting larger bass, but I don't know how to do it in that area. Obviously, certain rules are going to be the same. The bass are going to follow certain, rules of thumb where the bass are going to have to do certain things to survive, so they have to do certain things to survive. And that's what I'm going to have to figure out. What else did I want to talk about? We're getting some amazing footage for the Striped Bass Hunt Show. Having a lot of fun working with that. Estuary bite's been pretty fire. The bass or the bugs are horrible. They're bad right now. They're gonna only get worse. I'm getting dive bombed by birds every single time I'm walking out in the estuaries. And by the way, these are when I say I'm getting dive bombed by birds, there's this where I'm walking is under 2 feet of water at high tide. So there's no nests or babies in that stuff. And it's public. You can walk on that. Lots of people do. The people that run that area are I've walked, they're around. They don't care. It's not private or anything. And yeah. So anyway, the fishing in the estuaries has been really good for schoolies. I'm doing a lot of that during the day. You've probably seen a lot of it on my Instagram. Pretty much every morning I'm out there fishing the estuary. I pretty much dialed it in for every tide. Low tide, high tide, the bass are in certain different areas. Topwater's been super fun in the estuaries. Little spooks have been killing it. The bass, we got that first big wave through the rocks. I fished 7 days at night with eels, big plugs, everything, literally through the kitchen sink in spots that I thought would produce. Although they didn't do well this time of year. I'm in that normal lull that I would hit this time of year where off the rocks is a little bit slow for 3-4 weeks, and then it picks up really heavy, hot and heavy action and a little bit longer. As I was saying earlier in this podcast, the action's going to pick up, and it's going to pick up strong. So I'm super excited about that in general. What else did I want to talk about? The fishing has been pretty good for people north of me. I'm actually, I forgot, somebody DM'd me and said that I was a little bit quiet. I'm going to turn up the gain on my microphone here a little bit. Hopefully this helps because I am a little bit further away. This might help a little bit. I'm going to turn it up even more. Okay, yeah, that should be good. I hope that helps you a little bit listening to me. I know we're close to the end of this podcast, but hopefully that works. What else? Yeah, so I've been fishing a lot off the rocks and with eels mostly. What did I do? I've been getting a lot of those low 20-inch bass off the rocks and with eels. Probably, I don't know, I probably caught 25, 30 bass, that are all in that high 20-inch range, but it's been quiet. But it's so funny because the day that I caught that 40-inch bass, like I have in that exact spot many other times, when you're fishing that spot, you get schoolies early, you get one schoolie-ish, and then you fish it for an hour or so, and then the bite dies, and then you don't catch anything for like a while, like for a long time, and then all of a sudden you get that one tap, you hook set, and it's a 40-inch bass. And that's kind of what I'm having to deal with, because you don't want to end early, because you know that the bass could come out of thin air. And so I've just been putting in a stupid amount of time in a spot that has been productive, but it's been only productive very small. I'm at, in one little section. One day was very productive. Actually, 2 days this year so far in an area. Wasn't the same spot, but in the same ballpark, I would say, as far as off the rocks have gone. I was in 2 different spots, same 10-mile stretch of area, and the fish 35 and then a 40, which is good for this time of year. It is spring. I'm doing better than I did last year personally. So I just need to start trying to narrow things down early. And if I need to go fish I think that the best way to do this is to fish the river mouths. So that's what I'm trying to say is, I'm in this lull, and I know I'm in this lull, and I was in it last year. How do you figure out how to get out of that and find another productive bite for that time where you're in a lull off the rocks? And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going to fish the rocks every other day-ish, just to try to make sure that I'm not missing anything crazy. I also love fishing off the rocks, big plugs, big bass. Yeah, I've been fishing very heavy gear this whole spring, and it's just, it's a good thing I have, because, if you hook a big bass in the rocks, you want to be able to stop it, and I've been able to stop all of my bass and really been able to hold them if I really wanted to. And I just hold them as in not let them really run. I can control them. I can overwhelm them completely. And that's why it's been, it's just been, the gear that I have is absolutely perfect for what I'm doing. And that to me is the most important thing, more than anything else. If you can be so confident, and I said this in the last podcast, you can be so confident in your gear, the rest of everything else seems easy. Then your whole job is just trying to get into the bite, and then your gear's going to perform. You don't have to second guess anything. If you hook into a bass, as long as you keep tension, you're going to hold that fish. And that's so awesome, because those are variables I don't really have to worry about. It's all about learning the season, becoming more familiar with different structure, different areas, and it's a long road. It's very intimidating to look at how much I need to learn to be able to fish these areas. And it took me good solid 3 years to figure out the rocks to the extent that I did, or I have, and I'm still learning every single day. And it's going to take a good 3 years to be able to figure out these sandy beaches. Unless I get help from somebody, other than that, if I'm trying to figure them out by myself, it's going to take a solid 3 years. And that's when I'm talking to anyone out there that's getting into fishing, wants to catch a 40-inch bass, wants to catch a 40-pounder, or even a 50-pounder for that matter. It takes 3 years to become proficient in a spot that that you're catching all the big bass that are in that area. Now, that applies to any single scenario that you're fishing: jetties, beaches, river mouths, anything you're doing. If you spend 3 years perfecting that craft right in that area, you should be able to catch. You should feel, to the extent, at least I feel this way, that I'm catching all all the bass that I want out of that area at that time. Like there's not a 40-pound bass there that is passing up my stuff that I'm throwing at it. There might be, but I highly doubt it. The way that I fish and how I fish off the rocks, if the bass is going to be there, I'm going to be bouncing that eel off its nose every single cast, and it would be stupid not to eat it. And that's why I feel so confident off the rocks. But when you're learning a new spot, obviously if you learn one sandy beach and you pattern it down perfectly, and then you know a lot about it, then it's going to take a lot of the guesswork out of patterning down another sandy beach, and it might only take you a few months to do. And that's what I've done with many other scenarios where it takes only a month or two to figure out an area perfectly. And that's what I hope I can get to in estuaries and maybe even off the sandy beaches this year. But I feel really confident in the estuaries compared to what I do off of large sandy beaches. I think I want to do a little bit more exploring more north of me. Maybe do a little bit of stuff in Maine, because I think the bass fishing in Maine right now has been really on fire. And I think it's going to get better, although I do think we're getting big waves of bass through Cape Ann right now, and I'm really excited to fish that. And I really think that we're going to see some really big bass I'd say around the 15th of July-ish is when they start really turning on again, like mid-July. Early July has been tough for me historically off the rocks, so I want to try to fish to probably, around the 15th and figure out some other area that's going to be more productive in that time frame. But then off the rocks, because I just don't think the rocks are as productive from like late June to early July. There's like a good 3-4 week section that they're just really, it's just tough to get big bass. And then you get that wave of big bass that just enter the rocks and you're set for the rest of the season. And it's definitely not been for a lack of trying, because I can assure you I've spent a ridiculous amount of hours fishing the best way possible in the best structure possible to catch big bass, and I just haven't pulled anything of size within the past week. So hopefully I'm trying to turn that around. I'm not feeling like I'm failing by any means, because I've already caught some nice bass this season, but I just want to learn, and hopefully I can pull off something that I was hoping I could do, because I didn't know if it was even possible to do, but I hope that I'll be able to end up pulling this off. Anyway, I know I kind of did a lot of rambling and kind of talked in circles a little bit this podcast, but that's kind of what podcasts are all about. You guys get a little insight to what I'm thinking throughout the season, and I've really just not even scratched the surface to what I'm going to be doing in the next week or two, but I have an idea, a concept that I'm going to be doing something, and I think it's going to be the most extraordinary. It will be the most difficult thing I've ever done fishing-wise, especially patterning down structure-wise, and I think that if I just, grit my teeth and get through that section of just trying to start from the beginning, then it's going to pay off in the long run, especially in years to come, so I can guide there or do whatever, Like if I can either be productive, and then I can also guide, and then I can do other things. So anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast on really sandy beaches and what I'm thinking about right now and where the bass are and everything like that. And I will see you next time.